Pilgrimage to Spanish America by Everett Gill, Jr., Chapter 3, Part 2, Along the Caribbean Shores. Against the strong advice of other evangelical Christians who considered Cartagena an unbreakable granite rock, Reverend and Mrs. Thomas L. Neely opened our first mission there in 1943 of the Common Era. A nucleus of English-speaking Negroes from San Andres Island, a Colombian possession, constituted the foundation of the first work, but Spanish services were soon inaugurated in a rented house. From the first, bitter persecution was encountered. At one time, a crowd of half-drunk people marching along in one of their numerous religious processions was incited by the local priest to attack the mission houses as the image of Mary passed by. Fortunately, this attack was halted by the intervention of the mayor and the police. Later, Reverend and Miss Gerald Riddle joined the Neelys, and the four missionaries promoted an intensive campaign of evangelism and tract distribution. Across from the crumbling San Philip Castle on the main highway leading into the city, a commanding property was soon purchased, and the old residents used temporarily for services. Interest increased, and the baptismal classes began to grow. Victory came with the dedication of a new church, building an educational unit, the architecture in complete harmony with the colonial atmosphere of the city. In a thickly populated suburb, the Alcibia Baptist Church, led by Pastor Victor Martinez, also worships in a new temple. Each Sunday afternoon, 40 members from this active church gather for prayer and then go out 2 by 2 to visit, distribute tracts, and evangelize. Is it any wonder that people are converted almost every Sunday? Miss Helen Meredith patiently directs the growing primary school of the Alcibia Baptist Church. Along with secular subjects, Bible is taught daily, and Sunday school attendance is required of all students. When youth rallies were staged by the city before restrictions made them impossible, or when great patriotic processions were held, pupils from this school, dressed in distinctive uniform, marched as loyal Baptists and proud Colombians. The Central Baptist Church and the Cartagena Field came under the supervision of Reverend and Mrs. Zach J. Deal in 1948. Their responsibility extends 250 miles south of Cartagena to the Alto Sina River. 2 hours by plane, a day by bus, and 2 hours by horseback are needed to cover their field. On one of Mr. Deal's trips, he learned that a new convert, Marciano Leon, had been fatally stabbed by a fanatical enemy. Now, I think it's wrong to call people fanatics because they're on the other side or because they're really into it. That's not the same thing as it comes from people usually use the term fanatic as a hate speech term. Now, the action was, off, but as Marciano neared the end, he turned to his mother, who was bending over him, and said, "Do not weep. They have killed my body, but my soul lives on. It is this unquenchable faith of devoted believers that will ensure the victory of the gospel." In Colombia. Now, phantom comes from, that's the Greek term, and it's where our term fanaticism comes from. It's when you worship the leader, or the temple or the amulet or something, rather than, you do the ritual, you follow the principles, you follow the teacher, you worship as they worship or worship what they worship, but that's not fanaticism. But when you start worshiping the organization and stuff, regardless of whether you're breaking the law or doing some extreme thing or not, it's still fanaticism. Caribbean Island Mission, almost 500 miles northwest of Cartagena, lie the diminutive Caribbean islands of San Andres and Providence, possessions of Colombia, formerly under British control. They are populated by English-speaking Negroes who, generations ago, probably came from Jamaica and other British colonies in the Caribbean. About the middle of the 19th century, the Light Street Baptist Church of New York ordained Philip Livingston and sent him as its missionary to the islands. His was a monumental work, for with the passing of the years, the population of the islands became predominantly Baptist. The Southern Baptist missionaries in Colombia were invited in 1944 by Reverend Noel Gonsalves, pastor of the largest church in San Andres, to visit the islands. Mr. Gonsalves was a native of British Guiana and had been educated in Lexington, Virginia. Missionaries Swinesburg and Neely accepted the invitation and, while sailing across that blue expanse of water, were caught in a terrific tropical hurricane for 5 terrible days and almost lost their lives. At the journey's end, they preached to a crowded church and rejoiced in seeing scores turn to the Lord. When Pastor Gonsalves retired, the churches of the islands urged our board to send missionaries to assist them in developing their work. Reverend and Mrs. C.W. McCullough answered that call, and in 1945 arrived at the coconut-studded coast of San Andres, a tiny speck in the Caribbean, 2 miles wide and 5 miles long. Missionary McCullough reports the presence of 6,000 people and 4 million coconuts. These coconuts are the basis of economic life on the island. Nothing in the world, writes Mr. McCullough, can match a coconut boat for missionary travel. It smells in hardiness, in dangers, in monotony. Nothing compares with it. Yet, it smells. We find ourselves habitually gazing eastward with the populace looking for the tiny white specks of sail of the returning vessels. The return of those ships means mail, food, and possibly a new visitor. Providence, more rugged in appearance than San Andres, lies 45 miles to the north and is noted for fishing, cattle, horses, and sweet oranges. From its rocky summits, one can see the quiet harbor which served as a refuge for buccaneers of old. Morgan Mitchell and Hawkins knew every inch of its coves. The responsibilities of the McCloughs include 3 Baptist churches, 7 outstations, and 4 schools of these 2 islands. Much time and great effort have been spent in reorganizing and revitalizing the work, establishing Sunday schools, training unions, women's missionary unions, erecting new buildings, and teaching the meaning of Christian stewardship. Within 5 years, the gifts of the San Andres Church increased by 600%. The Cauca Valley. The fertile upland valley of Cauca River, enclosed by the central and western ranges of the Andes, is one of Colombia's richest sections. Just beyond the northern end of the valley lies Medellin, a great commercial center. Beyond the southern end, 225 air miles south of Medellin and less than 4 degrees above the equator, nestles Cali at an altitude of 3,200 feet. Cali is Colombia's gateway to the Pacific. A tortuous railroad connects it with Buenaventura, Colombia's only Pacific port of any importance. The Cauca region bore the brunt of vicious religious political persecution during the uprisings of 1948 to 1949 of the Common Era. Reverend and Miss J.N. Thomas, who arrived in 1950, saw some of the results of this violence and bloodshed. Only 100 yards distant from our place of worship, Mr. Thomas writes, a terrible massacre wiped out the lives of 26 men and left over 100 wounded. Especially in small towns and remote villages did evangelicals feel the pressure of violence and suffer the loss of their earthly possessions. Our Baptist congregation opened their hearts and purses to assist evangelical Christian refugees who crowded into Cali. The First Baptist Church of Cali worships in its own splendidly heated property. Out at the edge of the city, a new International Baptist Theological Seminary will be established to train young men and women for service in Central America, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. Dr. Julius R. Hickerson, Jr., warm-hearted preacher of the gospel and a student of marked ability, who was appointed by the Foreign Mission Board in 1949 to establish and become the first president of this significant institution on March 21st, 1951. After inspecting the new seminary property, he boarded a commercial plane for Cartagena, where he was serving as supply pastor. The giant airliner never reached its destination, and all occupants perished in the tragic disaster. Dr. Hickerson had much to give Colombia, but today he continues in a much more glorious and eternal service in the very presence of God. Underlined in red in the Bible which he used in personal soul winning are the words of one of his favorite texts: "For me to live in Christ is to die. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain." Dr. and Mrs. H.W. Schweinsberg, founders of the Colombian Mission, not only assist in the evangelization of Cali and the Cauca Valley, but are also supervising the opening and developing of Baptist work in Ecuador and Peru to the south. From Cali will radiate gospel influences to awaken and challenge all nations. A professor of philosophy, on hearing missionary Thomas preach on truth versus error, as revealed in the prophecy of Jeremiah, exclaimed, "That is the true philosophy indeed. Something in my heart has been touched, and I am convinced that you have the final truth." One Sunday evening, this professor came to the service with 5 friends. During the service, writes Mr. Thomas, it was most evident that the Spirit was working, and when the altar call was given, he resolutely and with holy discrimination rose to his feet in public confession of his faith in Christ, and with him also stood his 5 friends. Bogota, Andean capital, soaring into the bright skies above Barranquilla, on the Caribbean coast, airplanes follow the lazy Magdalena River toward Bogota, capital of Colombia. 450 air miles to the south, flat-bottomed steamers ply the yellow tide of this mighty stream, which has been called the axis of Colombian civilization. Before the days of the airplane, it was the only means of communication with the interior. Passengers changing from the river steamer to the Bogota train at a point 500 miles upstream. It is difficult to understand how this city, built literally on a mountain shelf, could have become a national capital with over 400,000 inhabitants. Although the city is changing rapidly, the influence of Spain is still marked. Men dress in somber black, and few women are seen on the streets in the evening. Bogota is characterized by the best Spanish culture and education as represented by its great university, which was founded in 1571 with its schools of engineering, medicine, law, and philosophy, and by the National Library. In the British Legion, which played a distinguished part in General Bolivar's campaign to free Colombia, there served a devout Scotch Presbyterian, Colonel James Fraser, who was shocked by the poverty, ignorance, and low morals of the common people of Colombia. Influenced by Fraser's reports, the Presbyterian Church USA, with the approval of liberal Colombian leaders, appointed the first evangelical Christian missionary to reach Colombian shores. He was Reverend Henry B. Pratt, who in 1856 arrived in Bogota after a strenuous journey up the sluggish Magdalena and over the mountains. Since 1948, Reverend and Mrs. Gerald Riddell have served as Southern Baptists general missionaries for Bogota and its environs, having arrived just as the city was recovering from a bloody political uprising. The expanding Central Baptist Church occupies a well-situated property on one of the main avenues and conducts a program of evangelism, education, and radio broadcasting. The Riddells also direct a youth center, which is reaching the university students of this great cultural center. Associated with the Riddells are Reverend and Mrs. A.R. Daly, who lead the Barrios Unidos mission in a thickly populated section of the city. A mission, while housed in a two-story brick structure with a chapel and an educational department. Mr. Daly also serves on the staff of the National Baptist publication El Heraldo Bautista, the Baptist Herald, a unifying force for the scattered Baptist. Miss Darlene Elliott, formerly of the Barranquilla, works with young peoples and women's groups in the churches, although Bogota does not dominate the life of Colombia to the extent that Buenos Aires does that of Argentina, or Rio de Janeiro that of Brazil. Janeiro, how do you say that? It still exerts a telling of influence over the affairs of the nation. If our message is to become known and understood throughout Colombia, the capital city must feel its full impact. Venezuela, Little Venice. Early explorers attracted to the north coast of South America by pearls named the section Venezuela or Little Venice after seeing Indian huts built on stilts along the hot shores of Lake Maracaibo. No great Indian civilization barred the invaders, and the scattered tribes were easily overcome and enslaved. So, there's obviously no excuse for war with the natives of America. Colonialization was carried on largely by commercial houses, which, armed with royal charters, used the Indians as slave labor. This exploitation led Friar Bartolome de las Casas to institute his renowned Indian reforms, by which the miserable lot of the Indians was improved somewhat through royal decree. Although Venezuela is larger than all of our eastern seaboard states combined, most of its 3.5 million people live in a small section on the Caribbean coast between the Caracas and Maracaibo, paralleling most of the country's 1,000-mile shoreline is a range of mountains with 22 snow-covered peaks reaching as high as 15,000 feet. South of these mountains sprawl 100,000 square miles of llanos, treeless, grass-covered, thinly settled by groups of llaneros, the cowboys of Venezuela. These plains are drained by the mighty Orinoco River, which flows north and then east for 1,600 miles to reach the Atlantic. In 1947, one of the world's most valuable iron ore deposits, with a 59% iron content, was discovered in this region and is being developed by North American steel companies. The country is also rich in oil. To reach the capital city of Caracas, the visitor, whether traveling by ship or plane, must pass through the ancient seaport La Guaira. From La Guaira, a glistening highway following the route of a twisting centuries-old road climbs steadily to a height of 3,300 feet around hairpin curves and then drops suddenly to Caracas, where the climate is like spring. Caracas, a city of 450,000, still has much of the charm of its colonial past, with narrow streets, quiet plazas, and flowering patios. But that appearance is rapidly changing. Avenues are being widened, and modernistic office and apartment buildings stand side by side with old, tilled one-story residences. Life revolves about Plaza Bolivar, with its mosaic pavement and bandstand for Sunday concerts, its orchard-bearing trees, and its famed bronze equestrian statue of the great General Bolivar. As in other parts of Spanish America, Baptist work in Venezuela was begun by Christians who had read diligently the Spanish Baptist literature published in El Paso. A self-supporting Baptist church had already been organized when, in 1949, Reverend and Miss Thomas L. Neely were transferred from Cartagena, Colombia, to Caracas to become a Southern Baptist first missionaries to Venezuela. In downtown Caracas, the artistically, I would never think that A is pronounced as an H, beautiful building of the Central Baptist Church attracts wide attention. This church's strong spiritual impact on Caracas is opening the door to the Baptist faith throughout the country. Caracas is known the world over for its gift to political freedom and the romantic and daring life of Simon Bolivar. After the tragic death of his beautiful young wife, he went to Europe and squandered a fortune in dissolute living, but also took time to read the liberal writings of French philosophers and to watch the growth of the struggling new republic in North America, the United States, which had recently won its independence from Britain on a memorable day in 1805. Standing with his tutor and looking out over the ruins of Rome, he made a vow to free South America from Spanish domination. After a visit to the United States, he returned to Venezuela to plot the overthrow of the Spanish government. With poorly equipped armies, he fought doggedly for 15 years in the face of unbelievable obstacles. In 1819, his army marched for a whole week through hot, flooded tropical plains in water up to their waists, and then climbed the icy Andes through 13,000-foot passes higher than the Alps, leading, imploring, and inspiring his ragged armies by sheer willpower. He engaged the royalist troops high in the Andes in Boyaca, Colombia, and won a major engagement on August 7th. To him, 5 modern Spanish-American nations owe their freedom from Caracas to Lima. Towns and villages have their Plaza Bolivar honoring the great liberator. Venezuelans are less proud of dictator Juan Vicente Gomez, who ruled with an iron hand for 27 years, from 1908 to 1935. Fired by ambition, greed, and lust, he crushed his enemies mercilessly, sending them to torture rooms, filthy prisons, and exile. He gave the people better roads, developed small industry and agriculture, and welcomed foreign oil companies. Through the income guaranteed from each barrel of oil, he was able to pay off the national debt, but public education and higher learning were forgotten. Honors were showered on him by the Pope and by European governments, while he lived in sensualism and oriental splendor at Maracay. When he died, the emancipated people swarmed into the central plaza of Caracas, tore his pictures from public places, destroyed his palace, and shouted, "The catfish is dead." About 190 air miles west of Caracas lies Barquisimeto, a modern town of 70,000 people, situated in a fertile valley on the northern borders of the Merida mountain range. In 1950, Reverend and Mrs. J.U. Moss were transferred from Colombia to Barquisimeto to serve as field missionaries in the states of Lara and Portuguesa. A Baptist church has been organized in Acarigua, about 50 miles south of Barquisimeto. Another flourishes in Guanara, home of the patron saint of Venezuela. During the annual religious festival, thousands of pilgrims travel from Guanare to visit the shrine of the Virgin, and many drop by to hear the gospel preached in the nearby Baptist church. Overlooking Guanare are broken remnants of an ancient Roman Catholic shrine, symbolic of the weakness of Catholicism in Venezuela, as contrasted with its strength in other parts of South America. This weakness may be explained in part, at least, by the reforms of General Guzman Blanco, who in 1873 ordered the expulsion of the Jesuits and all other monastic orders. He followed this order with the confiscation of church property, which had originally been purchased with government money, and the closing of the parish schools. Civil marriage was made obligatory. There should never be forced marriage. And cemeteries were opened for the first time to non-Catholics. Venezuela, one of the least Roman Catholic republics of South America, has only one priest for every reported 13,000 members, as contrasted with a ratio of one for each 500 Roman Catholics in the United States. In 1950, only 10 new priests were ordered in Venezuela. Maracaibo, a city of 150,000 people, fronts on the narrows connecting the Gulf of Venezuela and the huge lake of Maracaibo. In spite of an enervating tropical climate, the sanitation programs of the great oil companies assure good health conditions. Spanish explorers, disappointed at not finding gold, never dreamed of the wealth that lay beneath the waters of this inland lake. The oil industry is the backbone of Venezuela's economy and has also skyrocketed the cost of living. Oh, the cost of living to one of the highest in the world. As the second largest city of the nation, Maracaibo is becoming a great center of missionary activity, with one Baptist church already organized. All of the churches of Venezuela are members of the Colombia Venezuela Baptist Convention. A few years ago, Venezuela was closed to missionaries, but now it is wide open to our message. And the people are very responsible to the message of personal redemption and spiritual democracy.